Curtis, I know that you know how much I love talking about podcasts on a podcast. So when we do a podcast about podcasting, I should have guessed that you were going to call the podcast police on me.
I try. I've been trying to find you some guests who can talk about podcasting, and I think we got a good one today.
But really, we needed the police? I didn't even know there was such a thing.
There is.
What did you mean when you said I'm calling the podcast police on you?
Well, it's actually a good friend of mine, Jessica Pulis, that we're bringing on the show today. Jessica met her and her husband, going back 16 years ago.
Yeah.
Jessica's had quite the journey, I know, since then, though this podcast isn't about her journey, but you probably have a podcast out there about your journey. If you do,
Yes.
we could put it in the show notes because it is quite the journey. You and your husband have spent time overseas. You've lived in Europe. You've lived a couple different places within the States. You've had an excellent career. I think you worked at Clear Channel, correct?
Clear Channel before it was iHeart. Yep.
Yep. And even there, I remember when you got back from Europe and you came back with Clear Channel, they were then teaching you about digital advertising because prior to that, you were only, and you had this sheet. You're like, sit down with me and talk to me about Google advertising and Facebook advertising because I got to learn all of this now. So, you've been definitely a learner over the years, and transitioning as different advertising platforms have come out. But your background is in advertising for the most part, right, Jessica?
Correct. Advertising my whole career, just a couple of different routes.
Yeah. And so this recently, what I'm really curious about talking to you about is this recent route that you've taken, which is advertising in the podcast space.
Yes, it is. I started in local radio, and the transition to national podcast space is, it's a different animal, but it's a lot of fun.
Cool.
So Jessica,
Tom,
what do
I'm
you do?
giving you somebody you can learn from today then, who's doing not just doing podcasting, but doing advertising in the podcast space. This is a topic we have not covered in previous episodes.
That's right. I was going to ask you, so what is your day-to-day or your year-to-year job entail? What are you doing and for whom?
So I work with a company called Red Seat Ventures. We were just acquired by the Fox Corp, but it's been an independent company for well over a decade. We are kind of like an advertising agency for podcasts where our company partners with creators and we help them to build their podcast, and they've got their own content. They're in charge of their show, but we help to market it, help them if they need production. We help them with, my department specifically helps them with advertising. So we go out and we find the advertisers to fit in alignment with whatever the show content is, and the host that's hosting it. We find advertisers that want to partner with them.
And so anything that's still relatively new, right? It's not, hasn't been around as long as AM radio, for example. I would imagine there's still some people who are slow to adopt and adapt. So what do you think one of your best pitches to get somebody convinced that even advertising on a podcast makes perfect sense for their brand?
Well, it's kind of a couple of different avenues that you can approach it with, right? So you can look at it as they're a TV advertiser and you can direct them into the video portion of podcasting. You can look at them as they're a radio advertiser and you can transition them into the audio version of the podcasting, because I think podcasting has evolved so much over the past, even just in the past couple of years, where video has become so much more relevant in the podcast space, where before, back 10 years ago, it was just audio. You were going into wherever you get your podcast and you were just listening, but now you can do both. And so many creators are putting out video because they like to repurpose it onto social media, and there's a lot of different ways that people can partner with podcasters to fit whatever their advertising need is. Additionally, I think that the biggest draw for podcasting is that you can find your niche audience. So, a local radio station, they're going to have a big mass appeal. They're going to have one demographic that they're talking to that is kind of just to get the large volume of listeners. And you can do that with podcasting, but you can also drill down to a very small niche topic that makes sense for your brand. And that audience is going to that creator for that content. So it makes sense to have your brand there.
Curtis, that sounds like something we talked about last week, actually, with Claudia, in terms of podcasters having influence, obviously. So they're something of an influencer. But it's been interesting to watch you evolve from an advertising standpoint, because, you've had a long history of digital advertising, to now this word that keeps coming out of your mouth is this authenticity, which you seem, Curtis, to be like this huge advocate for authenticity. And it seems to me that when you are advertising a brand on a podcast that also aligns with not only your own personal belief system, but the audience that podcast serves, now you're getting into the realm of authenticity, where the ads sometimes don't even feel like ads sometimes.
Yeah, it's been my observation in doing this for over 10 years that the brands that do well are authentic, and those that are just pushing out advertising for the sake of advertising don't. They get that less than 2% conversion rate. You look at the brands that get like 7, 10, some higher conversion rates. They've done this work to, first of all, build the brand and build trust within their marketplace. And then two, the content that they're putting out there resonates with their ideal customer profile, right? So they've identified who that customer is. Our advertising only goes to that customer. So it's very segmented. It's very precise, that bullseye targeting. And then usually it's going to resonate at that point. We see the response that we get. You've established the trust. You've got the right message to the right audience. And then there's a response, that response you expect. You're not being gimmicky. You're endorsing something, or you're providing some level of education and something that you care about. And you're presenting it to people who also care about that same thing.
Jessica, that word endorsement that Curtis just used, is that something? I mean, obviously the AM personalities of the world, Howard Stern's, Rush Limbaugh's of the world.
You're going way back.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm showing my age. I didn't say Don Imus, though. But I do know who he is, so shoot. But there was always this endeavor to get celebrity endorsements, and I feel like that's a big part of the podcasting advertising space. Is that something you're working with clients to do as well?
Absolutely. A majority, I would say 90% of my business is doing host-read campaigns, because that's, people in the podcast world, they want to do business with the people that they know, like, and trust. So when you align yourself with a host that aligns with your brand and your product, and they've got that audience that aligns with them speaking about your product is kind of that transfer of trust. And that gives your brand just a little bit more of an edge. So 90% of my business is doing a read campaign.
Curtis, bookmark that term, transfer of trust. We got to use that. That's brilliant.
We'll re-listen to the recording, and sometimes I have to listen to these a few times before I really get what, the message behind what our guests say. It's like sometimes it takes a few times to be like, wow, that was actually really powerful what you just said there.
Yeah. Well, a transfer of trust speaks to something that sort of I was going to segue to, which is back in the day. So again, showing my age, it was all about numbers, right? So people wanted to know what was the reach, what was the circulation of the magazine. Are advertisers asking for those numbers, or is there more of a sort of leap of faith that says the numbers are one thing, but I want a density, something that Claudia brought up last week. I want a density of true hardcore fans, because I know that I can get that transfer of trust more easily than I can, say, reaching 1 million people, 10% of which are only engaged. So what are the advertisers asking for? What do you think are the important metrics?
So there's two different viewpoints, right? So first and foremost, reach is still a thing. So how many impressions are you going to get with one ad? The cost per thousand conversation. But then are you looking to cast a wide net, or are you looking to use a fishing pole? So when you have a broad topic show that is covering multiple topics, or a very broad topic, you're going to have that bigger audience, that bigger network of people that are tuning in. But when you have that niche podcast, that niche topic, and your audience is automatically going to be smaller, but the people that are choosing to tune into you, they're more in line with that niche. So again, you can also have that larger cost per thousand, because it's a more valuable, more premium audience when you have a small. So there's kind of two trains of thought there. But so we get both, right? So we have large shows within our network, and we have very niche shows within our network. And it's just a different conversation of what the advertiser is wanting to achieve with their campaigns.
And do you feel like advertisers are becoming more savvy around the value of, deep but narrow as opposed to wide but shallow? Or is that something you're still educating folks on?
It's a little bit of both. Some people get it, and some people are still stuck in the traditional model of, like a local radio. Like, how many times is my commercial going to air? Like, that you can tune in at, during morning drive at 9 a.m. But podcasting is different because people listen at all different times. So it is an education process, but more and more people are catching up with what the technology is doing.
Curtis, what about you? So I know that you're an analytical minded person. You love analytics and data. And one of the early metrics that you were going to measure our podcast on were the typical metrics, right? And I'm sure based on your aspirational visions, it was a disappointment at first. It always is when you're launching a new podcast. But how has your sort of thinking evolved? What do you measure, whether it's hard data or soft data, that says, okay, we're having an impact, we're reaching people?
Well, I was excited at first, and I think because I was doing, it was new. So you get that like initial set of people who are already, following you, customers, friends and family, our moms, right, Tom? They tune in, they listen. So they jump on, that increases, you get that first 100 subscribers. Okay. We did that. And then I did some advertising. So then I was like, okay, well, let's try and grow this, and at least on the YouTube side, so the video side. And we grew the channel. And then I started looking at the data. I was like, well, that didn't really work because I got all these subscribers, thousands of them, but nobody's watching. It's like, who are these people who actually?
Dang.
I got to click the button to subscribe. I don't know if Google's not showing the content, our episodes in feeds, and people aren't tuning in. I don't know if those are just bots subscribing or what it was, but I started to get a little disappointed, I think, in the amount that people watched. I look over on the audio side in Spotify. We get the longer listen times because we've talked about this, Tom. Those are the people they've got 30 minutes during a workout or 30 minutes while they're on a commute or they're mowing the lawn and they put headphones in. They can listen to that. It's they can do other things at the same time. And I think that's the beauty of podcasting is, it doesn't require 100% of your attention to tune in. So, that does fairly well. Where I really got excited, though, again, this happens sort of infrequently, but Tom and I have been talking about this term lurkers, and that we have these people who are kind of grabbing snippets, the shorts that we're posting on social media, and the little pieces of content that are part of a larger episode, and they're not necessarily subscribed, they're not necessarily listening to every episode, but they are consuming the content. And then lo and behold, out of nowhere, I'll either run into them or they'll shoot me an email and say, hey, Curtis, I've been listening for the last 6 months. Good stuff. I got a problem. Can you help?
Love it.
Well, it's the same thing.
I could speak to that for a minute because
please, Jessica.
Starting a podcast is very difficult. And so many people think, oh, I'm just going to get a microphone and publish my stuff and everybody's going to listen. I'm going to be this famous person. Not the case. There are so many people out there that just want this quick thing, but podcast takes time. You have to build something consistently. You guys are doing great with having a weekly episode, right? So keep that weekly episode, and that takes time to grow. The other thing that we often do within our network is when we have a new podcast that's launching, and we have a few that are coming in one of our networks in the next month. But what's going to happen is you're going to see them as a guest on another one of our podcasts, and they're going to reciprocate that and try to build off each other's audiences, because that is a fast way to grow and get that momentum behind it before putting advertising dollars towards your show, right? So being guests on other shows. But the biggest thing with podcasting is that it takes time. And then to speak to what you were talking about, the clips. So that's the beautiful part about everybody doing podcasts with video now, because you can take that large episode, chop it up into little pieces that people can digest quickly. And then they're getting the portion of the show that they really want, right? They're not having to sit down for a half an hour, or some of our shows are 2 hours, 2.5, 3, depending on who it is. And, that's a lot of time for somebody to commit to watching a YouTube or listening on Spotify. So taking that little bit and being able to repurpose it into social or even just in YouTube shorts or clips gives you more exposure and can grow your podcast even faster, even if they're not listening to the full episodes.
Wasn't that true early on for us? The shorts were getting way more views than the entire episode were getting listens.
Still is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sometimes like 400 on a short and 20 views on, the actual episode itself in YouTube, right? I mean, it's mind-blowing. Yeah.
Then people report to us, hey, I listened to your podcast. And,
exactly. But it wasn't the full episode. It was, yeah.
But we do know that people do. And this goes back to something that you both kind of touched on. There are two primary sort of categories of how you would measure the success of a podcast. One could be growth and reach and celebrity, say. I would say for most of our audience, B2B brands, put that whole thing to side and put it to bed and say, that's not what we're doing. What we are doing is a sort of multimedia version of what people have been finally adopting in the last 10 years, which is content marketing. So if a prospect is vetting your brand against another, and they have to go to your competitor's website, if they want to get a sense for how this person thinks and how they solve problems, they could read 10 to 12 blog posts if they wanted to. And that could be time consuming, and it might be a little dry, and it might be one dimensional. Or they can listen to, and we know people have done this, Curtis, or they could listen to 20, 30-minute podcast episodes while they're driving to work, while they're driving home that day, while they're on the treadmill, and not only get the same amount of information that they would have had they read 12 blog posts, but now they've got this 3-dimensional avatar of who this person is and what their personality is like. And am I going to like this person? Because I'm a B2B brand and 90% of the decision goes into, can I work with this guy? Which is paraphrasing Don Draper, right? So I'm not advocating for people in the B2B world to create podcasts so that they can grow their audiences and be the next Joe Rogan. I always say it's so that you can take what you're doing already in the content space. You've already, espoused the value of that and put it into video, audio, all of these other multimedia. So based on that, Curtis, now how do you analyze the first 18 months of our podcasting experience?
Well, I mean, the proof's in the pudding with the few, new pieces of business that we got from the podcast. I mean, you explained it perfectly. I don't think that the 2 clients that I can point to in the last 6 months that we did get through some effort of marketing didn't come to the website and read blog posts or read case studies. In one case, they came through a referral, but then consumed the content through the podcast and said, hey, I like how you guys think. Let's work together. Another one was a lurker and just had been somebody I knew from 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, hadn't talked to in probably 15 years, but had been following the stuff on my LinkedIn feed because we were connected on LinkedIn. And then finally a problem arose and I was somebody they thought of, obviously because the content was being published.
Yeah. And I think it goes to, I posted this on my LinkedIn not too long ago about telling your own story. So you guys have a great chance with what you're doing to tell your own story, and people want to connect and know who they're working with, right? They want to build that community and that rapport. So you guys, when you have that content and that real life that you're a human and you're a person and you're telling your own story, you have that engagement that is valuable to a listener or to, in your case, a client.
Jessica, speaking of something that you posted on LinkedIn, an article you shared, I may have been Forbes. It was the 7 emerging trends in the podcasting landscape. Do you remember that piece?
Yeah.
What resonated with you? Because all of the 7 emerging trends were interesting to me, but what resonated with you as somebody who's really deep into the space?
Well, I think the addition of video, and I think we've kind of already touched on it, the video and the microcasts, right? The little bits and snippets that we can share. Those 2 emerging trends, because like I said, it wasn't video a while back, but now it is. And when you're able to have that, I like to joke because being from local radio, it used to be, oh, you have a face for radio, but now you can't. Everybody is on screen or on video all the time. So being able to use video in serving it to the places that video works is a huge change over the years, but it's also creating a lot more engagement and in a different engagement, right? So people that are consuming on YouTube, for example, they're being served the algorithms and but they're getting the video, and advertisers like the fact that they can have, visual on screen, whether it's product placement or that lower third, banner for their vanity URL. And then with the audio side, it's people are more in tune and they subscribe more, and it's just part of their habits that they're going to. So the video has proposed this new opportunity for advertisers to be in front of other people that maybe they weren't in front of before, because it's the algorithms and it's also social, and you can take those little bite-sized pieces. So I think those two trends that have been evolving are helping podcasters reach people in different places.
Would you say, Jessica, that podcasting is still a bit of a blue ocean in terms of it hasn't been devoured by, the sharks in the water? And so maybe you have a better chance to sort of play in an area where you're not competing with thousands of advertisers like you might on FM radio. If there's a commercial break, it's going to be 7 minutes long. They're going to be every car dealer in the area plus private injury or personal injury attorney. It's like, I'm skipping past that. I don't skip past the ads when in a podcast, because I know it's only going to be 60, 90 seconds maybe. And they're back to what you said earlier. It's likely that I'm interested in these brands because they align with my interests.
So within the podcasting space, you'll have your programmatic ads, especially on audio, that are just fed throughout the dashboards across different demographics. But as far as the host read campaigns, you're getting maybe two to four per episode. So you are standing out within the content. So it is a much cleaner advertising environment versus traditional media. Because there's, less ad space.
So to both of you, who I think you both would say you're relatively newcomers to podcasting based on the trajectory of your careers, have you, because of getting into podcasting yourselves in various ways, have you become either more frequent or more savvy consumers of other podcasts because of what you do now? Either one of you?
100%.
Yep. I think there was a statistic you put out, Jessica, on LinkedIn. It was like eight. Isn't the average person is 8?
Yeah, podcast users are on average tuning into 8 different shows a week, whether that's from the same host or different creators.
More than one show a day, right? So it's the commute, it's the workout.
Yeah.
It's the
sitting, putting it on. I work remotely, so I put them on while I'm just, doing client outreach and listening to whatever show I'm into at the time.
So
and you're in that space too, Jessica. Well, if I could add, you mentioned you work for Fox now. That was Fox is the company that built. We have a lot of those individuals who have podcast shows. They were broadcasters on news, right? So they had shows. So they can definitely take that audience that they used to have. But I think what I want to say is these news shows are essentially stealing audiences who used to turn on their TV at night and watch the evening news. And now they're choosing to get that content from the same personalities, but it's not so much a news podcast. It's covering news content, but it's not that what happened today type of content. It includes still guests, but some of that analysis and those types of things, which is an interesting phenomenon. And I'd be curious, and haven't looked at the statistics of how many people, not just with news, but just TV in general, are turning it off. Like, who's advertising with Xfinity anymore?
Right.
Who, particularly in our age group and younger, even have an Xfinity Comcast subscription. They're streaming.
The cable cutters.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So are you talking about that at all when you're talking to your advertisers? And
it depends on the demographic. When what demographic you're looking at, and news podcasts are going to steer a little more male, 35 plus. So, but like if you've got a 65 plus, they might still be tuning into the television. So it really depends on what demographic. So we talk through that with the clients just to say, okay, who are you looking to target? Let's see if we have this audience within our network to give your exposure to.
I have a quick question, if I could add to your Tom. So the two areas that I'm curious about. One is, what genres, I guess, do you kind of see sort of exploding, at least, or maybe not even exploding, but just noticeably, besides the news stuff and the general content Joe Rogan personalities, but like, what type of content are you starting to see? And then from the advertising side, like, who's starting to really be interested then in wanting to advertise? Like, just thinking about like industries or verticals and those types of things. Like health, I see as like one area. I mean, there's so many health podcasts right now all across the board. That's obviously one industry that is rapidly growing. But what else are you seeing?
So we represent a majority of conservative political news. That's kind of our forte. We also have a section of our company is and the crime, true
True
crime thing.
crime?
True
Yeah.
crime, yes. So those are two niches that our company has really developed. I do see sports continuing to grow. That's always a huge, everyone likes to talk about their sports teams, and there's so many different ways that you can talk about your sports teams. Health is huge. I'm a big consumer of a lot of health nut and, Maha type
Mm-hmm.
podcasts. And those are, with
A lot of your
the
female
focus,
viewers, right? A lot of your
female
female
viewers,
listeners.
huge. Yeah. And, with the changes in people wanting to be healthier and wanting to, go backwards, right? And create our own food like we're supposed to. There's a lot of podcasts out there for those types of people. But, I think that niche podcasts are going to gain a lot of traction because they're going to be so micro focused, but those are going to be very small audiences, and those are going to be very smaller advertisers or very niche advertisers. But to answer your question on what advertisers are saying, I was very surprised at how, coming over to a conservative news platform from general media, I was quite taken back with how many people want to be in that space and advertise. And you've got everything from, the prepper type mentality with food supply and satellite telephones and that sort of thing. But, regular cell phones or like a bone broth company or, sheets. We have people that are advertising bedding on our podcast. So there's a very large audience that want it to be in that conservative news space. But I think as podcasts continue to grow, we'll start seeing some of those general market advertisers come into this space because they know the value behind it. But I think, when I was in local radio, there was a local radio budget and then there was a digital budget. I think a lot of that money is going to start shifting more into the digital space and the digital podcasting space, because when you're on a podcast, you're able to connect with that audience that's choosing to go consume that content. So they're going to have, bigger brands are going to have to be in multiple places just to be able to capture the audience that was all before just in one place.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's sort of my broad takeaway from whether it's podcasting or just new media in general is brands need to free themselves from the old mentality that we're going to buy the biggest number, say circulation or reach or whatever it is, and just know that there's wasted there, right? 10 to 20% of our audience is in there somewhere, and we're going to advertise to everybody and hope we get them. Whereas now we're taking this approach where let's go find 80 to 90% of your audience is listening, like you said, choosing to listen to something, not it just happens to be on the radio at Hudson's,
dentist
dating
office.
myself, Kmart, right? Is that how valuable is that impression compared to somebody who said, you know what, I'm pulling up this podcast today, I'm going to listen to the whole thing front and back. So people just need to rethink their strategy, and not just because an audience is small, think of it as inconsequential.
Exactly.
My last final takeaway is, what do you guys, either of you have a final takeaway, and then I'll wrap it up. So what would be your final audience? Maybe I'll pose mine as a question. Doesn't it seem to me, it does seem to me that podcasting is at the same, seems ubiquitous, because I don't know if you saw the meme this week that somebody created a AI Jesus podcast. It's so I think the joke there is everybody has a podcast, even Jesus Christ. So I think there's this joke that there's too many podcasts. I would submit that there is still greenfield for both creators and definitely for advertisers. Both of these types of people have opportunity to get into podcasting, and I think both types should still consider it. That's my final thought. Curtis, what's yours?
I agree. I think a lot of brands, especially the smaller brands, need to get creative. And what I'm seeing is Google ads, take a look at Meta, Facebook ads, even LinkedIn now. A lot of these digital channels are saturated. Mm-hmm. And that saturation does a couple of things. One, it increases the cost. The cost of advertising in these platforms, even just a few years ago, has upwards of doubled. I'm in one industry right now. We used to have CPCs at $5 to $15. I looked the other day; it's $77 for a click. I mean, these are attorney type fees. This is a construction vertical. It's not even building a whole home. This is in that general contractor space. $77 on a keyword. It's crazy. And then, you look at a 2% conversion rate. So it's like, you bring 50 people to the website, you get one maybe good lead. Maybe it's a good lead, right? So you just spend a lot of money for that one phone call. So you got to get creative. I think, part of that creativity is also that authenticity. So we've been wanting to have a podcast about this, Tom. I think we finally need to bring on a guest to talk about stop hiding behind your logo or hiding behind your brand. And the thing I love about podcasting is these personalities are, they're sort of exposed and they're vulnerable to open conversations like this where they could get stumped. And, so there's this authenticity and vulnerability about it that I think attracts a lot of people to it. Like, what could happen in this episode? It's pretty neat. So I'd encourage, if there's an opportunity for you to get somehow involved, whether you're advertising in some niche areas, whether there's some influencers who have podcasts that are in your niche and you can somehow come alongside them, great. If nobody's really doing anything and you've got the opportunity to educate and do something like what we're doing, it's paid off for us. So that's my own personal experience.
Yeah.
What you
It's
mentioned too
interesting.
about targeting is all about the bullseyes in our name, right?
Yeah.
So there's certainly value in having a bullhorn, but bullseyes is when you really get to the target audience. So yes, pun intended, target audience. So Jessica, your final thoughts.
So Kurt, it was interesting. You said how expensive keywords are. A lot of my clients are taking that money out of Google and Meta and putting it into podcast advertising and finding, a better success because they have that banner on the screen that gives them like a 10 to 15% lift in lead. You have the link in the show notes to link them right to both in audio and video, link them right to the product that they're talking about. But Tom, you had mentioned that, there's a lot of opportunity out there for podcasters. And I think that there's so much opportunity in the podcast world for anybody that wants to start a podcast. Because if you think about like somebody that wants to start a business, there's probably somebody out there that already did it. But the way that you're going to do it is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be unique to you, and it's going to probably help somebody that's out there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the podcast space for content creators and for advertisers to take that leap of faith.
Jessica, you teed up like my favorite quip when somebody objections. Does the world really need another podcast? And I always quip back, does the world need another website? You got one of those.
Yeah.
Right. So to your point, this is your voice, your opportunity to express your brand and not hide behind the logo. So do you have any anecdotal sort of stories from advertisers that maybe came over from traditional or terrestrial media and said, tried this and reported back to you? Wow, this is really good. They're probably apprehensive because they don't want you to raise their CPMs. But do you hear any of this sort of successes from the advertisers themselves?
We have all kinds of different conversations with our advertisers, but the one is the testimonials where they get a response from their customers that said, "Oh, I heard you on this show," or "I heard you on that show." And that is just a true testament of how our creators can be such a influence into moving product for people.
And that's actually my tip. I want to have one more final thought as a tip. That if you have this opportunity, if you're selling a product in your cart, or think about your cart, or if you're selling a service, think about this question on a form or when the salespeople get on the phone, is what led you to your purchase today? Or what led you to picking up the phone and calling us? There's likely multiple touch points. We've talked about the 7, 10, 11 rule.
Yeah.
But there's something that compelled that person to take action. And if you can frame that question, what led you to your purchase today? It'll not just give you attribution from a channel perspective of the last click, so to speak. It's that likely in that survey response will be what really was that compelling motivation that said, okay, I got to buy this product or I got to learn more. And the insight you're going to get to that, if it was, hey, I heard you on a podcast and so endorsed you, and are armed with that information to know whether or not it's actually working. We did this for a brand who, we looked at the data after sort of accidentally implementing this in another survey tool. And it was like a channel that they weren't even thinking about, but it was all sort of like a channel where people were referring and talking about the product, but they weren't like direct referrals. People were just talking about the product in a space that they weren't paying attention to. And then that just exploded opportunities to really like lean into, and we got to get more people talking about the product because people are trying to consume and they're looking for that content, right? So yeah, it's just sort of that endorsement. And then it was an area of authenticity. It wasn't you guys saying, hey, our product's the best, buy it. It was other people saying, we bought this, we tested it out, and this is what it can actually do. And so again, if you're selling a product, whatever, my tip is, what led you to your purchase today? Ask that question at checkout or have sales ask it, record that information and report on it. And you'll be surprised potentially at the insight you'll get out of it.
There you go. So you heard them, folks. So if you want 50% off the cost of an annual subscription to our free newsletter, Amplify and Aim, use the code Bullseye 2025 at checkout. All right. Cool. All right, Jessica, this was the best experience I've ever had with the police. So thank you so much for coming on. And the podcast police are welcome back anytime.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
See y'all next time on Bullhorns Bullseyes.